What if I told you that freedom didn't begin with a flag waving proudly, but with fear in the hearts of ordinary people? That the birth of America wasn't some clean, heroic moment, but a violent, uncertain fight where everything was on the line. We often celebrate the 4th of July with barbecues and fireworks, but rarely do we stop to ask, what did it really cost to light up the sky like that? Before the parades and anthems, there were farmers leaving behind their families, unsure if they'd ever come back. There were teenagers lying about their age just to enlist. There were towns burned, homes raided, and bodies buried in fields no one would remember. The Revolutionary War didn't just happen on famous battlefields, it happened in backyards, in whispers at taverns, in the quiet determination of people who chose to rise up against the most powerful empire in the world. And they weren't warriors by nature. These were blacksmiths, shoemakers, mothers with muskets, people who had nothing but a stubborn belief that life could be better than what the British Crown allowed. They weren't fighting for comfort, they were fighting for dignity, for the right to be heard, for the chance to shape a future they might never live to see. That's the part we forget. Freedom didn't just arrive, it was carved out by the courage of the unknown and the unheard. They didn't know how the story would end. They just knew they had to be part of writing it, and if we forget that struggle, we forget what freedom actually means. They won the war, but they didn't win peace. That's the part no one really talks about. After the final shots were fired and the British surrendered, you'd think unity would follow, celebration, clarity. But instead, America was thrown into chaos, because once independence was theirs, the real question came crashing in. Now what? 13 very different colonies suddenly had to become one nation, and they didn't agree on much. Some wanted a strong federal government to hold everything together. Others feared that would lead to another kind of tyranny, one they had just escaped. The men in those candlelit rooms weren't saints. They were stubborn, flawed, often afraid. They argued, they compromised, they threatened to walk away. And when the Constitution was finally written, it was incomplete. It didn't guarantee your freedom of speech or religion or even the right to protest. That came later in the form of the Bill of Rights, but even those hard-won amendments didn't protect everyone. Women weren't included. Enslaved people weren't even counted as full human beings. Native Americans were left out entirely, as if they didn't exist. The truth is, America's foundation was never perfect. It was stitched together by disagreement, fear, and desperate hope. But maybe that's what makes it real. It wasn't handed down from the heavens, it was built from the ground up, one bitter compromise at a time. When we talk about freedom, we often picture a finished statue, but in reality it was, and still is, clay in motion, shaped by conflict, by human hands, by people willing to argue, fall short, and try again. That messy, unfinished struggle, that is America. They said, all men are created equal, but not all men were free. Not all were even considered fully human. That's the brutal contradiction woven into the very fabric of America's founding, a truth we're often too uncomfortable to face. While the ink dried on the Declaration of Independence, millions of black men, women, and children remained in chains, bought, sold, treated as property by the same men who preached liberty. The same hands that signed the Constitution also held whips. The same minds that envisioned a nation of freedom refused to imagine it for everyone. And what about the native peoples? Entire nations erased, pushed from their land, broken apart because their existence didn't fit the American dream being drawn on parchment. It's painful, but it's real. Even in the birth of this so-called land of the free, justice had blind spots. And that blindness wasn't accidental, it was chosen. Entire groups were left out of the promise, not by mistake, but by design. And yet, within that hypocrisy, something remarkable happened. Enslaved people still dared to dream of freedom. Native voices still fought to be heard. The oppressed didn't just suffer, they resisted. They wrote songs, they revolted, they endured. That contradiction between what America claimed to be and what it really was isn't just a stain on history. It's a reminder that freedom was never evenly given. It had to be demanded, and it still does. Because the truth isn't meant to comfort us, it's meant to change us. History likes to spotlight the names we already know: Washington, Jefferson, Franklin. But the truth is, the soul of America wasn't forged by famous men alone. It was carried forward by people whose names were never written down. People who had no statues, no titles, no guarantees. Just a sense that something greater was worth risking everything for. It was a widow who gave shelter to rebel soldiers when the punishment was death. A teenage courier who rode through enemy territory with messages hidden in her skirt. Immigrants who barely spoke English but picked up muskets to fight for a country they hadn't yet been welcomed into. It was the blacksmith who melted down iron for weapons. The mother who fed strangers with what little she had. The preacher who gave hope when hope was hard to find. These weren't leaders in grand halls. They were believers in backrooms and barns, kitchen tables and fields. They didn't fight for power or recognition. They fought because they saw injustice and couldn't stay quiet. Because the dream of America, the real one, was always bigger than a single man's vision. It lived in the hearts of people who chose courage over comfort. And maybe that's the part history forgets the most. That freedom was never just won by speeches and signatures. It was earned in sweat, in silence, in sacrifice. And if we truly want to honor this country, we need to remember the people who built it with their bare hands and unwavering hearts. Freedom didn't arrive neatly in 1776 and call it a day. The ink on the Declaration was barely dry before new battles began. The truth is, the struggle didn't end, it evolved. Every generation since has had to rise up and fight for the promises that were made but never fully delivered. It was fought again in the bloody fields of the Civil War, where brothers turned rifles on each other to decide whether a nation that preached liberty could also tolerate slavery. It echoed through the voices of suffragettes who were jailed and beaten for daring to say women deserved a vote. It marched through Selma and stood at Stonewall. It sat at segregated lunch counters and stood in picket lines for fair wages and basic dignity. And it's still here. In every protest, every petition, every quiet act of resistance where people say, we are still not free. Not all of us. The struggle for freedom isn't just history, it's inheritance. It's a fire passed down generation to generation. And if we don't tend it, if we forget how hard it was to light, then we risk letting it burn out. Because freedom was never finished, it's still being written by us. History isn't just a list of dates and names, it's a mirror. And too often, we've been taught to look at a version of America that's polished, sanitized, easy to digest. But the truth, the real story is messier. It's filled with contradictions, with pain, with people who were forgotten so that a simpler narrative could survive. When we only celebrate the victories and ignore the struggle, we lose something essential, not just about the past, but about who we are now. Because understanding that struggle doesn't weaken our love for this country, it deepens it. It roots it in reality, not myth. And that's how we grow, that's how we build a future that actually honors the sacrifices made. So if this truth moved you, if it made you think, feel, or even question, then don't keep it to yourself. Like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and subscribe for more stories that don't just inform but awaken.